I saw that you grew up in Guatemala. So tell me a little bit about yourself. What was it like in Guatemala?
Sure. So I was born and raised there. Went to elementary school there and a little bit of middle school, and grew up in a small town in the mountains, kind of so cold. But we had family here in the States. And so my two older sisters lived here already, and then extended family, aunts and uncles. And so we would come and visit maybe once a year or once every couple of years. Mhm.
And when your journey, when you went from Guatemala over to here in the States, what was the most difficult part of that for you?
Well, when I first came the first time to live here, I was starting sixth grade. And so that was a culture shock because first, I didn't know the language. And second of all, I'd always attended small private schools. And I came here to a public school in Northwest Miami-Dade. And so the shock was, first of all, of course, the language, but also just the schools here compared were huge, and you had to change classes. There was a lot of chaos with the students. There was a big Hispanic population. It was a mix of, I would say, Hispanic and Haitian. And so it was an interesting mix, but it was inner city school. And so we had fights every day. Lunch, the cafeteria was chaos. And so it was a culture shock for me. But I did find a couple of friends it was funny, one of my best friends at that time, one was a Haitian girl and the other one was Jamaican. And they didn't speak Spanish. I didn't speak English. But somehow we became friends, and they kind of guided me through. And so it was hard in the beginning, definitely. But I think that having had to go through that, it forced me to learn the language pretty quickly, because even though we did have ESOL classes, so English as a second language, all the classes were in English. Everything was in English, and most of the teachers only spoke in English. And so it really forced me to have to learn it pretty quick.
And what's the most memorable moment you have with those two best friends?
Just trying to talk to each other and then trying to figure out. Sometimes they would say, just speak lower, just say it in Spanish, we'll figure it out, because they couldn't understand me, and vice versa. But that was just, I don't know, it's a testament, I guess, to friendships, because they were patient with me and I with them. And so it was just a trying to communicate with each other.
Gotcha. Nice. When you were kind of young Barbra, what did you want to be when you grew up before you chose the path of attorney?
Well, I always wanted to be a lawyer. That was always what I wanted to do. But when I came here to the US, I was here from sixth grade to ninth. I went back to Guatemala, graduated high school there, and came back after graduating high school. So when I came back, I was not a Florida resident. I was not considered a Florida resident. So I had to pay higher fees for tuition in school when you're not a Florida resident. And so I didn't live with my parents. And so I had to work during the day and go to school at night. So it took me about 7 or 8 years to finish my bachelor's, because I could only take a couple of classes per term. I had to pay out of pocket. And so my goal was to be a lawyer, but it took so long for me to get my bachelor's. I have my bachelor's in elementary education, that I thought, well, I don't think law school. I kind of gave up on that because, it took me so long to just finish my bachelor's. But being a lawyer is what I had always wanted to be since I was young. It was just, by the time I was able to do it, I was already married. I had already had my daughter. She was 2.5 when I started. So it's always been there. It's always been something that I had wanted to do. It just took longer than your normal path.
Awesome. And was that always an immigration attorney, or did that
No,
change?
no. So I knew I wanted to be a lawyer. I wasn't sure what type of lawyer I wanted to be. And so when I started law school, I did a couple of internships. I did an internship with a criminal defense attorney, and he had me work on a really, really tough case. And I knew I did not want to do criminal law at that point. And I have friends that do family law, and that's hard in itself, a lot of emotions, so I wasn't sure. I thought I wanted to be a prosecutor, probably. And so, but I also did an internship with Catholic Charities of Central Florida in their immigration unit. And so when I graduated from law school, I started applying for different jobs, but they had an opening at Catholic Charities. And because I had already interned there, they offered me the job. And so I was waiting on other offers, and I started working there. By the time I started getting other offers, I was already established at Catholic Charities, and I started enjoying the work. I have a lot of friends, and myself included, that have been through the immigration process, and so I decided to stay in that path.
So when you go to the United States as an immigration lawyer, what does that immigration process look like? How do people immigrate to the United States?
There's many different ways in which a person can immigrate to the United States. Currently, if you want to come to the United States as a non-immigrant, meaning you just want to come to visit, then you have to apply for a tourist visa in your country of origin. And it's a process, it's an application. You have to pay a fee, and you have to wait for the processing time to get an interview. And if you're approved, you can come to the US with a tourist visa. A tourist visa allows you to be here up to 6 months at a time, okay? And the purpose of that visa is just to come and be a tourist. You're not allowed to work, you're not allowed to do things that would violate that specific status. If you want to come to the United States to live, then there's different pathways. And that's changed over the years, but currently, one of the pathways is if you have a sponsor who's an employer who wants to sponsor you for a visa for you to come and work, and eventually you are able to stay here and live here and get your legal permanent card, your green card, as we call it. So that's one pathway. The other is if you have a family member that lives in the United States that is a US citizen or a legal permanent resident who wants to sponsor you as well. So you go through that process. You can't sponsor all of your family. There's just certain categories that are available. And so you can come through that, which is through family petition. Or you can come through some type of humanitarian visa. And those are typically available for people that are either running away from or from their country of origin, and that's where asylum comes in, right? Somebody that's fleeing their country of origin because they have been persecuted, and there's 5 protected grounds for that. And you have other people that are refugees, people that have experienced some type of either natural disaster or war, stuff like that, and the United States opened their doors for them to come as refugees. It's a type of protection for people that are suffering something in their country of origin. So currently, those are the pathways for somebody that would want to come to the U.S.
How has the immigration system changed? Because you said it's changed over the years. Has it changed at all since when you were 18 and came over here? Or is it about the same?
Yes, although at the time that I came here, it was still the same pathways, although The processing times were a lot faster. And when I want to say my aunt was the first one that came to the United States. She tells a story of coming into the United States, coming into at the airport, and the officer asking whether she wanted to apply for a green card there. That's not how it usually happens anymore. You have to have a sponsor, whether it's an employer or a family member. There was a time where we needed a lot of people to come to the United States to work, right? Because there was a huge need, whether in the fields or whether whatever that need was at that time. And so there was these programs that would allow people to come and work and then eventually stay. And so that's how it's changed. I mean, in the early 1900s, there wasn't really regulations as far as how people or the requirements of people coming in. 1800s, late 1800s, there weren't necessarily any requirements. The borders were open because there was a lot of resources and a lot of land and a lot of, people could come and work. There was that ability, but things have changed because the country has changed, and the needs of the country have changed as well. But yeah, when I came in, it was similar to what it is today. I think the processing times and what were a lot faster, and it probably wasn't as strict as it is today.
If you could change one thing about the immigration system as it stands, what would that be?
It would probably be the processing times. There are some cases that can take years. For example, somebody that comes to the United States seeking asylum, they sometimes have to wait years. And it could be 5 or plus years in order to be able to have a hearing, to have their cases be heard. And so processing times would be one. And number two, I think for me, it would be accessibility to the agencies. I deal with USCIS, which is an agency under the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And they are the ones in charge of accepting applications for people that want to apply for their green card, work permits, and all of that stuff. And it is so hard to be able to communicate with them effectively. And so it's hard to do your job when you are not able to communicate with the people that are supposed to be helping you do your job. And so I think those would be the two things that I would, we have a system and we have a process that works for the most part, but the system is broken in the sense of just outrageous waiting times, processing times, and just the inability to speak to someone and find out what's going on with this case. Basic things that I think would make the process just, of course, there are certain restrictions and caps that exist in the law, but I think as a practitioner, those would be the things that would make my job easier so that I am able to help people in a more efficient manner.
Did you ever have dealt with a case where those processing times have made someone not be an American citizen who is very eligible, or those? Yeah. Has that ever happened to you, or you had a case like that?
So, maybe a case where the person applied following the regulations, following the law, and there was a mistake on the government side when they were processing their application. And this was maybe 12 years ago. And still to this date, we have not been able to get them to fix this mistake. And so, yes, in that case, if the process had gone how it was supposed to, this person, after applying and following the procedures and doing everything, at this point, they would have been a US citizen. But they're not, because a mistake that was made by the agency, and because of those structures and the way that it's set up. And that's why I was telling you, there's no way that I can call somebody and say, listen, there's this case that we need to fix. And so we've been trying, but yeah, that would be a case where by this time, this person would have been a US citizen already, but the system is broken in that sense for him. Mm-hmm.
When you look around, one of the headlines that's been happening a lot is these ICE raids that are going on.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of talk about there's ICE raids of people deporting criminals. There's also ICE raids of people deporting like kind of hardworking families.
Mm-hmm.
What are your kind of, as a immigration attorney, how do you sort of see that? How should we look at those headlines, and how should we respond to them?
Sure. So I think we have to start with the premise that headlines are, for the most part, biased, whether to the right or to the left, right? It's very rare to see a headline that is neutral. And it's understandable. I'm not a journalist, but as a journalist, you're a human being still. And so that bias usually comes in through what you write and the headlines that you write. And so I'm very careful about reading headlines in newspapers, because I know that there are biases, right? So, but the truth of the matter is that these some of these things are happening, maybe not necessarily as they're being portrayed. And so, yes, ICE is an agency that their function is to detain and enforce immigration law. And if somebody is here that is not here without status, then their job is to detain that person and then figure out what's the process, right? Do they get a hearing? Are they in some type of process? The problem is that, and I guess this is where the question comes in, right? Should ICE as an agency be focused on detaining and trying to deport people that have criminal backgrounds? And by criminal backgrounds, maybe we're talking about more severe type of criminal offenses, right? Because then you have people that are in the United States that have no legal status. Maybe they entered through the border without authorization. So in essence, they broke the law. So they're here without status. They continue breaking the law because they don't have status, but that's their only time that they broke the law. They haven't committed any other offense. So do we treat this person that entered without legal status and continues having no status, but has no other offense, and maybe they pay their taxes, they have good moral character, right? They have, they're good members of their community. Should we treat them the same as somebody who also entered without legal status, but has been arrested for other types of criminal offenses, assault and batteries and thefts and attempted whatever, right? Do we treat those two the same? And the original argument was, no, let's focus and prioritize these people that are a threat to the community, right? And then let's find out who they are, detain them and have them go through the process. And if they need to be deported, have them be deported. And what's happening right now is that a lot of people are arguing that those two are the same, because these people also broke the law when they entered without status and they remained here without status, and therefore they're criminals. And so my argument is, yes, they both broke the law, but there's different in severities of crime and of maybe rehabilitation and other things, right? Like them having paying taxes and being good members of their community, etc. And so what's been happening now is that ICE, if you have no legal status, you're at risk, regardless of if you have more of a rap sheet than somebody who just entered. And so I think that's the question that a lot of people are asking, right? And so, yes, some of the things that you hear in the news and in the headlines, that ICE is detaining people that have severe criminal backgrounds, as well as somebody who is a hard, yes, that because this person doesn't have legal status, so they technically have no protection. And so I think it comes down to, as a country, do we have the resources? And is that what we want to do? Do we want to detain everybody that has no legal status and deport them and start from scratch? Or do we find a way to say, okay, these are two different people. And yes, this person did this, but maybe there's a pathway to rehabilitation, and it's been shown in their conduct in the past, because there's been no other, they haven't committed any other crime. In fact, they pay their taxes, they have children, and they volunteer, and they have business, whatever the case may be. But the headlines serve to divide us, because we are on polar opposite sides, and a lot of times, we're not getting to the root of the argument, which is what do we do with all these people, right? And can we differentiate between those two?
Yeah, and I think as Americans, it's a little bit weird, because on the one hand, I would love people to come to America. America is awesome. On the other hand, you don't want to be importing gang members or people who are going to be stirring up crime. Mm-hmm. And you get people who really want this American dream. The immigration system takes such a long time to get through here. It's very expensive to do it. And then they come here and so they see this other pathway, which is, well, you can just walk into the country, and they lay these foundations. They work very hard. They help forward the American economy. They're great citizens to the nation. And then all of a sudden it's, well, you immigrated here illegally and you must now be deported. And it's really messy when you see that, and the political divides don't help.
Right.
And have you observed this? It seems that in the political headlines, it's less about, I feel like it's less about what's correct and a lot more about what is the opposite of what the other side is saying.
Yes. Yes. So I find it that people will look at the other side, and even though they may agree with some of the things that the other side is doing, because they hate the person in charge, then they're oblivious, or they ignore everything else. And it's really hard, because from on the left, maybe that they think that there's some things that the right is doing that is right and that is correct and that it should be done, but because they hate the person in charge so much, they don't even take a look at, they don't even hear the arguments. They just focus on the hate that they have, and vice versa, right? We hate the leader so much that we're not willing to look past the leader and sit down and have arguments take a look at the root causes of the problem and seeing how I think we have a lot more in common than not, but we can't get to those arguments because we are focusing on what we hate about this specific person in leadership and vice versa. So yes, that's definitely something that I see on both sides. Mm-hmm.
When people are deported, what happens to them? What does that look like for people?
It depends. If someone is detained, they can be held in a detention center, and they can go through the process of removal, being detained. There are people that can go through the process of removal, but they are not detained. So they're outside and they're fighting that process from the outside. But if somebody is in removal proceedings, right, or deportation proceedings, and the judge, let's say, finds that they don't qualify for anything, they're removable, then the judge enters a deportation order. And before this administration, the judge would enter the deportation order, and then the person would have 30 or 60 days to self-deport, right? Now it's different in the sense that the government is actively deporting people. So detaining them, putting them on the plane, and sending them back, or actively advocating and encouraging people to self-deport. In fact, there's an application that the government has created specifically for people to go on that app and self-deport and register. And I think they are able to qualify for some type of financial bonus if you do it that way. And so those are typically the ways in which somebody, and you know, if you're a citizen of your country of origin, then you get deported there. There was a time when they were detaining people and deporting them to third countries, and that happened some. But for the most, that's typically what happens. Right now, I think the focus is getting people, the government saying, if you know you can't be here and there's nothing you can do about your status, then self-deport. Just, you know, go through the app but do it that way. But for those who don't, and if they are in that process, then the government will physically deport them. Mm-hmm.
I've heard that the vast majority of deportations have been self-deportations through this app. Why do you think that is?
I think that there is fear. Say somebody has been here for many years and they don't, they have kids and they don't have a pathway to fix their status. And if the alternative is that you will get detained by immigration and be placed in a detention center for God knows how long, then I think that they make the choice of, I just rather leave on my own and be able to prepare my kids and be able to, you know, either sell my things or do it in a more efficient manner, right? They prepare their property, their things, and then just leave on their own accord. I think that seems a lot better to some people than waiting and risking being detained and then being in a detention center for months without, you know, knowing what's going to happen, and your kids ending up somewhere where you don't, you know, or with people that you don't even know. And so I think it's a lot of people do that like risk assessment, right? Like what are the pros and the cons? And if they realize that they think they're at risk of getting detained, they just decide to go on their own.
As we're talking about going through the American immigration system, a lot of people have asked the question, what is an American? And so I want to present that question to you. What is an American? How would you define them?
That's a great question. I think an American is someone who values the foundations of this country. Somebody that understands, maybe not necessarily on an in-depth level, but even on a basic level, why this country was created. And somebody that respects the freedoms that we have, right? So I think it has to do with how you value your country and how you understand what being here actually means. You know, I think we take for granted a lot of the rights that we have, and also the responsibilities that we have. I mean, just the fact that we have freedom of speech as a right, that's huge. But and as an American, I appreciate that, because, you know, I'm from a country where that's not necessarily respected all the time. And so I think for me, it comes down to, again, understanding why we were created as a nation and the foundations of who we are, and respecting and appreciating all the rights and freedoms and responsibilities that we have as citizens.
So you'd say being an American is knowing and abiding by American values and upholding American culture. Is that a good?
Yeah. I don't know about the word culture as much as values, because I think culture could be subjective, but more values and foundations, I would say.
Nice. I loved reading your book, Through God's Eyes. In the book, you go through your 8 truths.
Mm-hmm.
The first truth is, even through bitter experiences, God has a plan for you.
Yeah.
Kind of walk me through each one of these truths.
Sure. So yeah, the first one, even through bitter experiences, God has a plan for you. I think that as a Christian, I believe that even though we as humans suffer and walk through difficult circumstances, I believe that God can use that for good somehow. And I think that's hard to think of when you're going through the hard experiences. But even in my own life, I know that through the difficult circumstances that I've lived, you know, in my childhood and adulthood and all of that, I have seen how God has used each and one of those things, not necessarily for me, but also for the people around me. And so yeah, I think that's number one. You know, he has a plan somehow. And even through this immigration experience, I'm able to share with people, you know, maybe, right? It could be that maybe God's plan is for you not to be here. Maybe he has a plan for you back in your country of origin, right? Maybe he has a plan for you somewhere else. Maybe, right? I don't know God's plan for everybody, but I'm able to talk to people in that way. And gotten to know people that, they decided that, well, they couldn't be here. They didn't have a path to fix their status, and they've gone back home, and they've thrived, right? And so I can see the hand of God moving in that way. The second truth is words can either be fruit or poison. And that's just, and I've taught my kids since they were little about the power of words, and the power of the words that you use for people, and the power of words that we use for ourselves. And so, just always being very careful about the things that I say about myself, about those around me, trying to build up people instead of tearing them down. So that's that one. Let's see. The third one, past experiences may have distorted our perceptions of ourselves. So, sometimes our past experiences have made us look in the mirror and see this distortion of ourselves, because, we have been scarred or may have had injuries from past experiences. And so, those experiences can sometimes, if we're looking at ourselves through our own eyes, we see this distorted perception of ourselves. And that's why the book is called Through God's Eyes, because when we see ourselves through his eyes, we don't see what we see with our own human eyes. Number 4, it's not all about you. And that one, a lot of times we think that the world revolves around us, and it really doesn't. Sometimes people will do something to you, and we take it so personal, and it has nothing to do with us. It has a lot to do with whatever the person is going through. And so it's helpful to step outside of our own selves and think, maybe this has nothing to do with me. Maybe this interaction or this bad attitude that someone gave me has nothing to do with me. It has to do with whatever the person is going through at that moment. And when we see that, it kind of takes a weight off, right? Because everything is not about. The 5th one, we often disqualify ourselves. Sometimes we think, there's no way I could do that. I'm not smart enough. For some of us, it takes, I remember when I was in law school, one of my professors, it was our first year, and he was talking about Bill Clinton and his wife, Hillary Clinton. And he said, Bill was very smart, and he didn't have to study. Everything just came easy to him. Hillary had to do her homework, meaning some people have to work extra hard at something, right? And so some people, things just come easy. And so sometimes we disqualify ourselves because we think we just can't do it. And sometimes we miss out on opportunities because we disqualify ourselves. Number 6, people are often afraid to admit their shortcomings and weaknesses. I think that it's very freeing when you can say, this is my weakness. This is my shortcoming. I need help. And then you move forward. Because a lot of the times we are in denial of things that we are weak, where we're weak, but I think that there's freedom in acknowledging where your weakness is, so that maybe there's somebody that can help you. And in that help, you can grow. And number 7, we have all been victims of something, but through Christ, we can find a path to victory. This was, I remember I was in law school. We were doing a symposium or a conference, something. And we had this, and I talk about that in the book. We had this very prominent, famous judge come, and he said a phrase, something like that, majority of those in that classroom were minority students. And he said something about you're all victims, right? Like you've all been victimized by the system. And I thought, that's an interesting thing to say. And in a way, maybe that's right. We have all been victims of something. But that doesn't mean that we should stay as victims. Especially as Christians, I think that through Christ, we can find a path to victory. And yes, there's certainly some of us that have experienced more maybe unfairness and injustices and all of that stuff. But we don't have to stay in that victim mentality. And I think right now, victimhood is so, I don't know, popular. People, because when you're a victim, you're catered to. People look out for you and people treat you differently. And so that's glamorous for some people. And so, I think that yeah, a lot of us have been victims of something in the past, but we don't have to remain that way. We don't have to stay that way, especially as Christians. And the last one is God is willing and able to transform your life. If you're willing, he will walk with you and guide you during the process. And that's just, as Christians, that's just the way, right? Like he's able to transform us from who we were, from all the stuff that we went through, and he is going to walk with us through the process. And not an easy one, but certainly one worth taking.
And truth number 3,
Mm-hmm.
you say past experiences have disordered our perception of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
What were, if you're comfortable sharing it, what were some things that disordered your perception of yourself due to a past experience?
Yeah, so I suffered different types of abuse as a child. And obviously in your formation years, I mean, all those experiences really shape how you see yourself. I lived with a person who was very, he was physically abusive, but also very mentally, I would say, abusive, and just the things that he would say. And so I started growing up with a sense of, that I wasn't worth much, very low self-esteem, and just didn't think I would amount to a lot, because that's what I heard, right? Like those were the things that were being fed to me. And so it took me a while, and really only by the grace of God, I can say that I was able to change that mentality. I remember going to church as a young teen and hearing, the pastors talking about God as our Father, and our Father, God this and Father that. And I found that very, I couldn't understand or relate to that, because the idea that I had of a father was a distorted one. I mean, somebody who was abusive in all types of ways, and somebody that didn't really care much about me. And so you're talking about this God person as a father. I don't relate to that. And I think that was probably one of my biggest distortions and the biggest struggles that I had, was relating to God as my father, because all I had was this example and this idea of this person who was supposed to protect me, this person who's supposed to love me, this person who's supposed to, do all these things, did the opposite. And so I think that's where the danger comes in, of when, because we're going to be hurt, our parents are going to hurt us, because they're human, right? And they're sinners as well. And so they're going to do things that are going to maybe hurt us. And if we're not careful, those things are going to, when we look in the mirror, we're going to see ourselves because of that experience. Or you're going to hear, oh, that's what my my dad says about me, so that's what I must be. That's what this person says. But no, it's once you start seeing yourself through God's eyes, you see, oh yeah, that happened to me, and those people have said that about me, and that's the example that I've seen, but that's not who God says I am. God is a good father. He cares about me. And so, yeah, I would say that was probably the biggest distortion in my life. Mm-hmm.
Was there ever a point where the kind of view of yourself shifted from the kind of the past you to or the moment where you saw yourself through how God sees you as opposed to how you saw yourself?
Yeah, but I don't think it was like from one moment to another. I don't think it was like a light switch. Like, no, it was getting to know him more. It was learning to trust God, learning to believe the words that I was reading in his word. It was it was hearing things about God from healthy places. It was through my relationship with him and through my walk with him that I began to see changes in me. And not that I've reached it all, right? Like there's still days where I have to remind myself where my identity comes from, because it's very easy to place your identity in the things that you can see, right? In who you are, in who people say you are. And so it's still a constant thing for me. And so I can't say I'll pinpoint this specific point and this is where I see myself through God's eyes, but it's more of a journey of every day. Just the more I get to know him, the more I realize who he is and who I am in him. But it's definitely been a journey. Mm-hmm.
I love your truth 6, that people are often afraid to admit their shortcomings and weaknesses. Mm-hmm. What were some shortcomings and weaknesses you noticed in yourself that you had to change and alter?
Insecurity, I would say and it's still probably is. I don't know if you've heard the term imposter syndrome, right? That's a big one for me because, I've met people who are way smarter and way, they pick up things a lot quicker. So, for example, in law school, you have to read and brief a lot of cases for every class. And sometimes I would read a case and I'm like, I have no idea what I read. It would take me a lot longer to understand concepts or read or understand what is this case about. And I would hear my classmates speak and I'm like, how did you come up with that so fast? And so I think that's probably the biggest one, just thinking, I don't think I'm smart enough for this, or I don't think I'm smart enough to do that. And so maybe, right? Maybe, but going back to what that professor said about Bill and Hillary, Bill was smart. He didn't have to study. And Hillary, she had to study. She had to do her homework. So in my case, I know I have to do my homework. I have to do. And so if I'm going to give a presentation, I can't just from one day to another. No, I know I have to prepare. I have to research. I have to take my time. So that's where that comes in, right? Like, you know yourself, you know your weaknesses. So what are you going to do to make sure that you can stay ahead, right? Or to not fall behind. Once you're aware of those, then you know how to prepare. I need to take, if this person takes an hour to get ready, it takes me 2 hours, and that's okay. I will take that time. And that's why it's important for you to understand your own weaknesses, because then you know how to plan according.
Yeah, imposter syndrome is kind of difficult because in a lot of ways at the beginning, like you are an imposter. Like
Right,
you don't know what you're doing.
right, right.
Mm.
Yeah,
And you've
that's
got to
true.
learn. Mhm.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, yeah. And some people, some people are very good at faking it. um, but I think for a lot of us, that imposter syndrome stays, and again, that's where I go back to my identity, right? Like, who am I? Why am I doing this? Who is, and when my identity is tied to who God says I am, you know, but when my identity is tied to who people are saying I am, my own capabilities, that's where things start to, that's where I start to struggle.
Was there a moment where that identity kind of maybe made you mess up, or that maybe you in the beginning you made a mistake and that kind of you had to sort of recover from that? I'm not sure how to phrase that question.
I think for me, when it comes to identity, there have been places where, and I'll tell you, like in my marriage, right? In the beginning of our marriage, because I was still trying to figure out, walking with the Lord and trying to deal with all the childhood stuff and who I was and my identity and stuff, I had a very hard time accepting when you've been hurt a lot. You develop this self-defense mechanism, right? Because you don't want to open the doors to people hurting you. And so I think that was kind of where I was. And so when I got married, it was very hard for me to allow myself or my husband to fully love me completely and me being vulnerable enough. And so I think that's where that identity issue probably comes in, of where you have this idea of yourself and it's very hard to let go of that because of what's happening. It's not, again, until um you truly see yourself, your identity through God, that you can then be vulnerable and allow people in and all of that stuff. But I would say for me, that was probably the hardest in terms of identity. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciated having you on and you talking about everything that we discussed here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I truly enjoyed our conversation.
Awesome.